The ex-husband and his mistress went to a party and unexpectedly ran into his stunning ex-wife. Leave your like and subscribe to the channel to receive the best stories firsthand. The town of Belhaven was known for its refinement and exclusivity, and that night the restaurant Le Marchand, one of the most sophisticated in the region, was booked for a gala event. Entrepreneurs, investors, and high society influencers were gathered to celebrate the annual award ceremony for the highlights of the financial sector. Ethan Callaway entered the hall with firm steps, carrying his usual aura of confidence. Tonight's dinner was a golden opportunity to consolidate his image as one of the most influential names in the market. At his side was Celeste Harrington, a young advertising executive who, in recent months, had become his constant companion. Celeste was magnetic, engaging, and loved being in the spotlight. "They'll be talking about us all night," she whispered with a satisfied smile. "I love that." Ethan smiled, adjusting the buttons on his jacket. "Talking about me, you mean?" She laughed and squeezed his arm, feigning irritation, modest as ever. The two were greeted by hosts and photographers, while waiters passed by with trays of champagne. Ethan greeted acquaintances, exchanged calculated words with investors, everything going exactly according to plan. Until, the moment he looked at one of the main tables, his body tensed. She was there. Vivian Hayes. Ethan felt an immediate impact when he saw her. The woman he had left behind, who had once seemed so dependent on him, now occupied that space as if she had always belonged to him. Her navy blue dress emphasized her elegance, and her hair loose in soft waves added a touch of lightness to her striking presence. She wasn't alone. She was chatting engagingly with a group of businessmen, drawing smiles and admiring glances. She seemed unattainable, and for the first time, Ethan realized that he knew absolutely nothing about the woman Vivian had become. "Who's that?" Celeste asked, observing the intense way Ethan stared at the table. It took him a second to answer. "Vivian," he said without taking his eyes off her. "My ex-wife." Celeste raised an eyebrow, assessing the scene. It doesn't look like the divorce shook her up too much. Ethan didn't reply. He knew Celeste was right. Vivian not only looked well, but radiated a kind of security he had never seen before. And then in the middle of the conversations and toasts, Vivian's eyes met his. It was a second of absolute silence inside Ethan's mind. The room was still full of voices and laughter, but he couldn't hear a thing. Vivian held his gaze without hesitation and with a slight smile raised her glass in a discreet toast. That seemingly simple gesture made something inside Ethan turn around. "Mr. Callaway." The excited voice of one of the evening's organizers drew him back. "How nice of you to come. We're gathering the main guests. Please, come and sit down." Celeste took his hand, leading him, but Ethan could feel Vivian's gaze still burning into his skin. And then the inevitable happened. The chairs were arranged for the first part of the awards ceremony, and to his surprise, or perhaps fate, he and Celeste were taken to exactly the same table as Vivian. The tension was palpable the moment they sat down. Vivian maintained her elegant posture, without showing any discomfort. On the contrary, she seemed slightly amused by the situation. "Ethan," she said, bowing slightly in a casual greeting. "What a surprise to see you here." "Vivian," he replied, forcing a smile. "I had no idea you'd be among the guests." "I imagine not," she said unhurriedly, "but the events committee invited me. I've been collaborating on some strategic projects for the awards." Ethan blinked, surprised. He had no idea that she was involved in such things. "Vivian has always had a flair for strategy," one of the businessmen at the table commented. "Her company is revolutionizing the marketing sector for the financial market." Celeste, until then observant, smiled with a sharp tone. "Oh, so you work in finance too?" Vivian turned to her, maintaining the same serenity. "In a way, yes, but my specialty has always been storytelling. The financial market has many interesting narratives, and I just help shape them in the right way." Ethan pressed his lips together. He knew that game well. Vivian was making it clear that she had built her own path, a path where he was no longer the center. Dinner continued with light conversation, but Ethan was becoming increasingly restless. He tried to concentrate on Celeste, But his mind kept returning to Vivian, the way the others seemed to respect her, the sparkle in her eyes, the lightness with which she spoke. Ethan wondered, since when had she become this woman, and why did he care so much now? As the waiter served the main course, Vivian glanced at Ethan and smiled, a small, almost imperceptible smile, but loaded with a meaning he couldn't decipher. The evening proceeded at a calculated pace, full of rehearsed conversations and smiles of convenience, but Ethan could feel the tension growing by the minute. The dinner that was supposed to be a celebration of achievements had turned into a minefield, and the epicenter was Vivian. She was there, at the same table, but she seemed to belong to a completely different world than he remembered. He watched her discreetly between toasts and speeches, trying to understand what had changed in her. The Vivian of before was always in his shadow, shaping her life around his wishes, waiting for a glance, for the slightest recognition. But the woman sitting in front of him now asked for nothing. On the contrary, it was she who commanded the attention. "You've been acting strange ever since you saw her." Celeste's voice cut through his thoughts. She had returned from the drinks table with 2 glasses of wine. The remark wasn't a question. It was an observation laden with expectation. Ethan took the glass without looking at her. "It's nothing." Celeste tilted her head slightly, assessing the empty response. "Right. And I'm naive enough to believe that." But he didn't reply. His eyes returned to Vivian, who was smiling as she listened to something one of the businessmen said. The twinkle in her eyes was natural, unlike the look she used to give him in the past, a look that waited for something that never came. Flashback. Ethan and Vivian's wedding. At first, everything seemed promising. He was a rising name in the investment world, charismatic and strategic. Vivian, on the other hand, was talented and dreamy, a passionate writer who had aspirations of her own, but who somehow always put his priorities before her own. The first cracks began to appear when she tried to share her ambitions with him. "I got an offer to publish a book," she said one evening, her eyes shining with excitement. Ethan, engrossed in emails on his cell phone, just muttered, "That's great." "Great?" She expected more. "I really want to invest in it." "Maybe take some time to write," he sighed, finally putting down his cell phone. "Vivian, now is not the time for you to get lost in fantasies. Do you have any idea of the stability I'm building for us? What you have is already enough. Enjoy it." That left its mark on her. The marriage became a monologue where he spoke and she listened, where he decided and she molded herself. At first, she tried to be understanding, but then she began to feel invisible. Then came the betrayals. Not overt scandals, but subtle signs. Work nights that became more and more frequent, unknown perfumes on his shirt, smiles exchanged with other women at events. Vivian pretended not to notice until she couldn't ignore it any longer. "You're with someone else, aren't you?" she asked one evening, holding up her wedding ring with trembling fingers. Ethan stared at her, and instead of denying it, he shrugged. "Vivian, you make too much of a drama. Maybe if you were more interesting like them, we wouldn't have to have this conversation." Those words were the last straw. She didn't argue. She just picked up her things and left, leaving behind the woman who sacrificed everything for a man who never saw her value. And he just moved on. Or so he thought. Back to the present. Now, sitting there at the same table as Vivian, Ethan realized that she had done something he never thought she could. She had blossomed without him. "She left you, didn't she?" Celeste asked, her voice carrying something between curiosity and provocation. Ethan forced a smile. "Not exactly. I was the one who decided to move on." Celeste played with the rim of her glass, assessing his expression. "But not before I made her someone who had to reinvent herself in order to survive." Ethan swallowed, but didn't reply. Vivian seemed immune to his presence, as if he were just another guest at the event, and not the man who had shared years of his life with her. This bothered him more than it should have. As he tried to process his feelings, he heard a snippet of Vivian's conversation with a man next to her. "Your last book was amazing, Vivian," the man said, a renowned editor. "You captured the essence of disillusionment and transformation in such a visceral way. I can't wait to see the next one." "Thank you," she replied, smiling. "Pain, when transformed into art, can be liberating." Ethan felt a tightness in his chest. He knew exactly what pain she was talking about. Every line of that book, every metaphor, every page was a literary version of the hell he had put her through. Celeste noticed his discomfort and raised an eyebrow. "She wrote about you, didn't she?" "Maybe," Ethan admitted, trying to keep his posture. "Well, it looks like she's moved on," Celeste said, taking a long sip of her wine. "You should do the same." But he couldn't. Final game. Just when Ethan thought the evening couldn't get any more uncomfortable, Vivian stood up and walked towards him. Her every step was firm, calculated. He felt the eyes around him turning to what was about to happen. She stopped a few centimeters from him, her presence dominating the space. "Ethan," she said, her voice low but sharp as a blade. "I think it's finally time we had a talk." And for the first time in a long time, he felt afraid of what would come next. The evening progressed at the Le Marchand restaurant, but for Ethan Calloway, the luxurious surroundings and polished conversations seemed increasingly suffocating. The award ceremony, which was supposed to be a celebration of his success, now became a psychological game in which he had no control. The reason for this? Vivian Hayes. She was just a few meters away from him at the same table, chatting to the night's top businessman, with an ease he never imagined she would have. She seemed comfortable in that world, as if she had always belonged to it. Ethan tried to ignore her, but it was impossible. Her every laugh made him realize how much more he didn't know about the woman who had once been his wife. Next to him, Celeste Harrington, his girlfriend, was watching the growing tension. "You still haven't answered me," she said, sliding her fingers along the stem of her wineglass. "Why were you so uncomfortable when you saw your ex?" Ethan picked up his own glass and took a sip, choosing his words carefully. "It just took me by surprise." Celeste arched an eyebrow, clearly doubting. "Does that mean you broke up badly?" "Over is not the right word," he said, looking across the table where Vivian was smiling as she answered a question from an investor. "I've moved on." "But has she?" Celeste asked, a sharp tone in her voice. "Because honestly, she doesn't seem the least bit shaken by your presence." Ethan was annoyed by the comment, but kept his expression neutral. Celeste was right. Vivian didn't show any resentment, let alone longing. On the contrary, she seemed absolutely indifferent to him. He looked away, trying to concentrate on dinner, but Vivian's conversation with the businessmen around the table kept drawing his attention. "Your work is changing the market, Vivian," one of the directors praised. "The way you're conducting positioning campaigns for investment funds is impressive. I've never seen someone translate numbers into narrative so well." Vivian smiled modestly. "Thank you. I've always believed that every market has stories to tell. In the world of finance, people talk about statistics, but forget that behind every number there is an ambition, a dream, a calculated risk. I just help turn that into something people want to hear." Ethan frowned. He knew that speech. It was the same way he himself used to talk about investments, but he never imagined that Vivian, of all people, would become such a relevant piece in this game. "So, you've become an expert at selling illusions," he said without thinking. Silence settled briefly on the table. Vivian turned her eyes away from the investor and rested them on Ethan, with a small smile on her lips. "No, Ethan," she replied, her voice calm but sharp. "I've become an expert at telling the truth in a way that people really understand." Tension hung in the air for a few seconds before the other guests started talking again. But Ethan knew that this moment had not gone unnoticed. Celeste noticed his discomfort and leaned in slightly. "Darling," she said, in an almost theatrical tone, "you look tense. Is it strange to see your ex glowing like that?" "Don't be ridiculous," Ethan retorted, but without much firmness. Celeste just smiled. She could sense that there was a lot more to the story than he wanted to admit. Flashback. Ethan and Vivian's wedding. Vivian had always been creative, passionate about stories and storytelling, but during their marriage, her career was never a priority, at least not for Ethan. "I got an offer to work in the marketing sector of a large financial consultancy," she said one evening, excited. "They think I can help the company connect better with the public." Ethan, who was reviewing reports on his laptop screen, just muttered without raising his eyes. "Marketing, that's not a real job in this market." Her enthusiasm waned a little. "It's a real job. just with a different strategy. He finally looked at her. Vivian, why waste time on this? You have a comfortable life. You can focus on more appropriate things. She remained silent. More appropriate. He meant dinners, social events, appearances. But Vivian wanted more than to be the woman next to Ethan Calloway. She wanted to be someone on her own. Over time, Ethan stopped noticing her altogether. He became cold, distant, increasingly obsessed with his own success. And when she realized that he would never see her value, she made the hardest decision of her life. On the night of the divorce, while signing the papers, Vivian stared at him one last time. "One day, Ethan, you'll notice my absence," she said. "But then it will be too late." Ethan didn't reply. At that moment, he thought she would never have the courage to become something without him. He was wrong. Back to the present. And now there she was, proving that not only had she moved on, but that she never needed him to shine. Ethan swirled the rest of the wine in his glass, trying to ignore the weight of the past. But when he looked at Vivian again, he realized that she was getting up from the table. He knew in that instant that a confrontation was inevitable. Vivian walked towards him with the same confidence with which she had walked through the night. Her every step seemed calculated, and Ethan felt his throat go dry. She stopped right in front of him, keeping a calm expression, but with a sharp glint in her eyes. "Ethan," she said, her voice low but firm, "I think it's time we had a talk." And for the first time in a long time, he felt really unprepared. The tension between Ethan and Vivian condensed in the air like electricity before a storm. He tried to keep his composure, but her steady gaze made him feel that his every word would be analyzed, taken apart and reduced to nothing. "Vivian," he began, adjusting his tie with a mechanical gesture, "I don't think this is the best place for this." "No?" She tilted her head, a half-smile playing on her lips. "That's funny because it seems like the perfect place." Celeste, next to him, crossed her arms and maintained an impassive countenance, but Ethan could see that she was absorbing every word. "I would have thought that, after all this time, you would have changed," Vivian continued, her tone sharp but calm. "But apparently the priority is still the same, parading around with flawless women and keeping up appearances." Celeste pressed her lips together, but remained silent. Ethan let out a heavy sigh. "Vivian, let's leave that conversation for another time." She laughed softly, without humor. "Oh yes, of course, because in your world, important conversations can always be postponed, ignored, or replaced by something more convenient." He frowned, feeling his blood run hot. "What do you want from me?" Vivian uncrossed her arms and took a step closer. "Want? Nothing. I just thought you might need to be reminded that not everything can be solved with a bank deposit." Ethan felt a tightening in his stomach. He already knew where this was going. "While you're here celebrating yet another achievement," she continued, her tone unchanged, "your son is wondering why his father never calls. But of course, you must think that paying for the best schools and sending money is enough. After all, it's always easier to buy affection than to show it, isn't it?" The blow was accurate. Celeste looked at Ethan, and this time he saw something different on her face, a doubt that hadn't been there before. "That's not fair, Vivian," Ethan replied, keeping his voice low. "I do what I can." Vivian let out a dry laugh. "You do what you can." She tilted her head slightly. "So tell me, Ethan, what's his best friend's name? What was the last story he told you excitedly? Do you know what makes him wake up in the middle of the night?" His silence was enough for an answer. Vivian then turned to Celeste, with a look that was slightly amused but carried a subtle weight. "I hope you'll be patient. If you go far, you'll need it. The constant outings, the vague excuses, and the messages he never answers become unbearable after a while." "That's enough, Vivian," Ethan cut in, his voice louder than he had intended. A few people nearby cast curious glances his way, but then went back to pretending they hadn't heard anything. Vivian just looked at him, gauging his reaction. "I'm not making a fuss, Ethan," she said softly. "I'm just reminding you that some responsibilities don't disappear just because you choose to ignore them." She then gave a small smile, one that didn't carry any affection, just resignation. "Good luck, Celeste, really." Celeste didn't reply immediately. She picked up her bag slowly, glancing at Ethan, as if she were reconsidering everything she thought she knew about him. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away, leaving him alone at the table. Ethan felt a growing discomfort in his chest. Celeste wasn't important to him in the way that Vivian had once been, but her leaving like that, without discussion, without drama, without looking back, hit him in a strange way. But nothing prepared him for what came next. Vivian leaned slightly towards one of the event organizers and whispered something. The man nodded and called for a waiter. A few minutes later, she got up and walked to another table, unhurriedly but with a clear decision. Ethan watched in disbelief. She had asked to change tables. She would rather sit with complete strangers than spend the rest of the evening around him. The restaurant was full of lively conversation, but for Ethan the silence was deafening. He felt exposed, discarded, ignored in a way he had never experienced before. As dinner went on, Ethan realized something he had never experienced before. He was out of place, uncomfortable, as if the world around him had moved on and he had been left behind. He watched Vivian interact with other people, her laughter light, her posture relaxed. She didn't seem to carry any trace of the pain he had caused her. Worse still, she seemed genuinely happy, and that bothered him more than anything else. He noticed how all eyes were on her, how the businessmen and investors respected her opinions. One of the men at the table, someone he considered important, seemed particularly fascinated by Vivian, leaning in slightly as she spoke. Ethan felt his anger boil over. He never thought he would lose control of the telling of his own story. But there he was, reduced to a mere spectator while his ex-wife became the protagonist. He called a waiter and ordered something stronger. The wine was no longer enough. As the evening drew to a close, Ethan found himself leaning against a corner of the restaurant, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He didn't know if it was the alcohol or the weight of Vivian's words, but something inside him felt different, and not in a comfortable way. Vivian, about to leave, cast one last glance in his direction. There was no disdain, no resentment, just indifference. And of all the things Ethan could feel that night, that was the one that destroyed him the most. Dawn was slowly breaking when Ethan finally left the restaurant. The cold city air cut into his skin, but he barely felt it. With his mind clouded by alcohol and Vivian's words, everything seemed distant. He walked to the sidewalk and unlocked the car, but hesitated before opening the door. His head was spinning, and he knew that in that state, driving would be a mistake. With an irritated sigh, he put the key in his pocket and called a cab. When it stopped in front of him, he got in and leaned his head back on the seat, closing his eyes. "Where to, sir?" He hesitated. For the first time in years, he didn't want to go home. The thought of being alone with his thoughts was suffocating, but there was nowhere else to go. 718 Westbrook Avenue, he answered, his voice slurred. The car started, and Ethan stared out of the window, watching the city lights blend into blurs. His mind echoed Vivian's words, repeating them like a cruel mantra. "Your son is wondering why his father never calls." Ethan woke up with a throbbing head and a bitter taste in his mouth. The apartment was completely silent, except for the sound of distant traffic. He sat on the edge of the bed and rubbed his face, trying to shake off the hangover. But the bad feeling didn't just come from the alcohol, it came from something deeper, something he didn't want to name. Vivian had moved on. He knew that now. But what hit him hardest was realizing that, while she was rebuilding her life, he had simply given up on being a father. He got up and walked to the kitchen, pouring himself a strong coffee. But instead of getting ready for the day as he did every morning, he picked up his cell phone and, without thinking too much, typed Vivian Hayes' name into the search engine. There were several interviews and articles about her work in the financial market. Articles praising her innovative approach to strategic marketing. He clicked on one of them, but the words soon became just a background. What really mattered wasn't there. He went back to the search and scrolled some more, until he found something different. A professional page. It was writing articles about the impact of storytelling in the world of finance, sharing insights into how companies could communicate better with investors and customers. It was brilliant, engaging in a way he had never imagined the financial market could be. For some reason he kept scrolling, clicking on links, trying to absorb everything he could about this new version of Vivian. And then, without realizing it, he ended up on a more personal profile. A recent photo caught his eye. Vivian was sitting in a park, and next to her, a boy was smiling, holding a notebook scribbled with colorful drawings. The golden sun illuminated his dark hair and curious eyes. Ethan's heart leapt. He magnified the image, holding his breath. It was his son. A knot tightened in his throat, and he slid his eyes to the caption below the photo. He teaches me every day that true love is not in perfection, but in acceptance. My little world, my amazing boy, my warrior. And then, the sentence that froze him. Autism has brought us challenges, but it has also shown us what really matters. Love always wins. Ethan remained motionless. The coffee cooled in his hand, and his vision blurred for a moment. Autism. He read the caption again, as if his mind was trying to deny the information. His son was autistic, and he never knew, because he never asked. His chest tightened in a way he didn't know. Vivian's words echoed in his head once again. Do you know what makes him wake up in the middle of the night? He didn't know. He never had. And suddenly all the money he had sent, all the checks he had signed, all the schools he had paid for seemed insignificant. He had never been there. He never bothered to get to know his own son. Vivian never stopped him. She never demanded his presence. But she never called to demand anything either. She simply accepted that he chose to stay away. And he realized, with a suffocating tightness in his chest, that he had lost years of his son's life because he had become exactly the man he never wanted to be. The shame came like a wave. Ethan put the phone down on the table and ran his hands over his face. He didn't know what he would do next, but he was sure of one thing. He couldn't go on being that man. Ethan spent the whole day at home thinking about his choices. He could hardly sleep. The next day, the sun was streaming through the gaps in the curtains when Ethan opened his eyes, his head throbbing with the weight of the night before. The apartment was silent, but inside, a whirlwind of thoughts continued to spin relentlessly. This time, it wasn't the work that was exhausting him. It wasn't the parties, the contracts, or the business dinners. It was the truth that he had spent years ignoring and which was now staring him in the face mercilessly. He picked up his cell phone and dialed Vivian's number. He hesitated before pressing the call button, knowing that she probably wouldn't answer. And he was right. The call went to voicemail. He tried again. Nothing. Obvious, he muttered to himself, letting out a sigh. Then, with no other option, he wrote a message. Vivian, I know I failed as a father. I saw everything yesterday and realized how absent I've been. I don't want to be that man anymore. I don't just want to send money, I want to be there. Please let me see him. He waited for a few minutes, staring at the screen. No reply. He had to do something, now. And so he made a decision. He grabbed his car key and drove to the only place he knew he could find his son. The school where his son went to school he knew. Ethan arrived at the school just before quitting time. The iron gate was open, and some children were already coming out in groups, laughing and chatting. He stood beside the car, his heart beating faster than he'd like to admit. It was ridiculous that he should feel nervous at the sight of his own son. Finally, he spotted Leo. The boy was coming out of the building holding his backpack, his eyes shining as he showed something to a teacher. He was gesticulating excitedly, explaining something in detail. Ethan swallowed. It was the first time in a long time that he had really stopped to watch his son. Leo looked like a mixture of Ethan and Vivian. He had his mother's expressive eyes and his father's tall build. But there was something else about him, something Ethan had never noticed before. The boy had specific movements, a rhythm of his own. As he spoke, he swayed his body slightly and his hands made repetitive gestures, as if following an invisible pattern. Ethan had never noticed, because he had never been close enough to notice. Before he could take a step towards his son, a familiar voice interrupted him. I can't believe you're here. He turned and found Vivian standing a few meters away from him. She was wearing casual clothes, but her posture was firm, her eyes narrowed in a mixture of surprise and caution. I needed to see you, Ethan said, trying to keep his composure. Without warning, without planning. Do you really think that's how it works? Her voice wasn't aggressive, but it carried a weight that he felt straight in his chest. "I know I did everything wrong," he admitted. "But I'm trying to put it right." Vivian crossed her arms. "And you think showing up here all of a sudden solves anything?" Ethan looked at Leo, who was now laughing at something one of his colleagues had said. "No, but it's a start. I called you, I texted you, but you didn't answer." Vivian sighed, massaging her temple. Finally, she looked at her son, who still hadn't noticed them. "I'm not going to stop you from seeing each other," she finally said. "I never have. But you need to understand something, Ethan. Leo can't be treated as a one-off appointment. He has a routine, he has needs that go beyond what you imagine. If you're going to enter his life, it has to be for real." "That's what I want," he replied, his voice firmer than she had expected. Vivian analyzed his every expression, as if trying to detect the truth behind his words. Then she nodded slightly. "Then you can take him home today," she said, "if he wants to go." Ethan felt unexpected relief, but there was still one obstacle. Leo had to want to see him. Vivian made a discreet sign and the boy finally noticed them. When his eyes landed on Ethan, his expression changed. He didn't look excited, but he didn't look scared either. Just uncertain. "Hi, Leo," Ethan said, trying to sound natural. "Hi," the boy replied softly, holding the strap of his backpack. Ethan bent down to meet him. "I thought we could have a hot chocolate, only if you want." Leo looked at Vivian, who just shrugged. It was his decision. After a moment of silence, he finally nodded. "Okay." Ethan let out a discreet sigh. "Great." The two went to a nearby coffee shop. Leo sat with a slightly stiff posture, fiddling with his mug without looking directly at his father. Ethan noticed the boy's hesitation and tried to find a way to break the ice. "So, what do you like most about studying at school?" Leo shrugged. "Math." Ethan was surprised. "Math, huh? That's great. Any particular subject you like better?" Leo finally looked up, suspicious, as if he hadn't expected his father to really be interested. "I like doing math, logic problems, equations." Ethan smiled, leaning forward a little. "Really? When I was a kid, I loved those challenges that seemed impossible at first, but then made sense when you found the pattern." Leo blinked, surprised. "Me too. I like solving difficult problems." The tension at the table eased a little. For the first time, Ethan felt that he had found a point of connection with his son. Leo began to talk more, explaining that he liked mathematical puzzles and how he felt when he finally found the right answer. Ethan listened intently, absorbing every word, because at that moment nothing was more important than that. When the hour passed and Ethan drove to Vivian's house, Leo hesitated before getting out of the car. "Are you going to see me again?" Ethan didn't need to think. "Yes, I promise." Vivian, who was waiting outside, looked at him with an expression that was hard to decipher. "I hope you keep it," was all she said. Ethan just nodded, knowing that this time words wouldn't be enough. After Leo entered the building, Vivian stood still for a moment before turning to Ethan. "That doesn't erase the years you spent away," she said bluntly. "I know," he replied, "and I think about it every moment." Vivian stared at him, trying to gauge whether he was really changing or whether it was just another passing flash of conscience. "I'm not going to make it easy for you," she said, crossing her arms. "If you want to be a father, you'll have to prove it. Not for me, but for him." "I will," Ethan said without hesitation. She was silent for a moment before nodding. "We'll see." She then entered the building, leaving Ethan alone on the sidewalk. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like running away. He finally understood that if he wanted to be part of Leo's life, he would have to build it from scratch. And it didn't matter how long it took, he was willing to try. Ethan stood there for long minutes after Vivian had entered the building with Leo. The cold afternoon wind cut across his face, but he barely felt it. Her words echoed in his mind. "If you want to be a father, you'll have to prove it." He wanted to, but did he know how? The first meeting with Leo had been better than he expected, but it was far from enough. There had been years of distance between them, years of silence, and now, after finally taking the first step, A doubt was throbbing in his mind. What if it's too late? He got into the car and stared at the steering wheel. His reflection in the rearview mirror stared back at him, and for the first time in a long time he didn't like what he saw. The man in the mirror wasn't strong, he wasn't successful, he was a coward. Vivian never asked anything of him. She never called to demand his presence, never begged him to be a father. Because deep down, perhaps she knew what took Ethan so long to admit. He was always the kind of man who took the easy way out. But now there was no way out. The only option was to move on. And the first step was to find out everything he'd lost. Ethan spent the night devouring all of Vivian's social networks. Now that he knew what to look for, every photo, every text, every post seemed like a piece of a puzzle he'd never tried to put together. Leo was on almost all of them. But what really struck him were Vivian's accounts. In a post from 2 years ago, a photo showed Leo holding a school certificate. The caption read, "Today he taught me once again that everyone's time is unique. No matter how difficult it seems, he always finds a way to shine." The comments were full of support. Friends congratulating the boy, praising Vivian for her strength. But Ethan was fixated on one particular response. A woman called Sienna Blake wrote, "His progress is incredible. He's a brilliant boy, but you never had any doubts about that. I wish more parents had your vision." Sienna Blake. The name was not unfamiliar to him. He typed it into Google and within seconds found a professional profile: child therapist, specialist in neurodevelopment and autistic spectrum disorder. Ethan felt a tightness in his chest. Vivian had never mentioned that Leo was in therapy. She never said a word about her son's difficulties. Why? The answer was obvious. Because she didn't need him to know. Because he never made a difference. Ethan threw the phone down on the table and wiped his hands across his face. This was unbearable. Knowing that his own son had lived through challenges he had never even imagined. That while he was at business dinners, signing contracts, parading with models, Vivian was struggling alone with her son and still working to be the brilliant professional she is today. How many times must she have looked at her phone and thought about calling him? How many times must she have given up because she knew he wouldn't pick up? He needed to talk to this therapist. He needed to know what he didn't know, but how? If he called Vivian, she would never allow it. He looked at his cell phone again. There was one way, and it would be now. The next morning, Ethan parked his car in front of Sienna Blake's office. The discreet sign on the door read, "Child Development Center, caring for little geniuses." He took a deep breath before entering. The receptionist greeted him with a professional smile. "Good morning. Do you have an appointment?" "No, but I really need to speak to Dr. Sienna. My name is Ethan Calloway." The woman hesitated. "What about?" He clenched his jaw. "It's about my son." The receptionist frowned, clearly surprised. "Just a moment." She picked up the phone and made a quick call. After a minute, she hung up and looked at him. "She can see you now." Ethan felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He didn't know what he was about to hear, and he didn't know if he was ready for it. But he went in anyway. Sienna Blake was a woman in her 40s, with intelligent eyes and a gentle smile. But the look she threw at Ethan was far from welcoming. "So you finally decided to show up," she said bluntly. Ethan swallowed. I just want to understand better. I want to know about what I've lost." Sienna crossed her hands on the table and stared at him as if trying to decide whether he deserved those answers. Finally, she let out a sigh. "Leo is an exceptional child," she said. "Intelligent, perceptive, and with an incredible capacity for learning. But he's also had difficulties. Many." Ethan remained silent. In the first years of school, he had problems communicating with the other children. Not because he didn't want to, but because the world works differently for him. Loud sounds bother him. Sudden changes of routine can be extremely difficult, but he has learned to cope. Vivian taught him how to deal with it. Ethan looked away. When he was younger, he would spend weeks obsessing over numerical patterns. He saw patterns in everything, in the tiles on the floor, in the street lamps, even in the arrangement of objects in the room. It calmed him down. But if something got out of place, it was as if his world fell apart. Ethan felt a tightness in his throat. He remembered how much he had loved mathematical patterns as a child. Maybe Leo had inherited it from him, but he'd never been around to notice. Vivian brought him here when she realized that he needed help to understand his own emotions. He's always been very independent. But deep down, do you know what hurt him the most? Ethan looked up. Sienna held his gaze. His father's absence. The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. He never asked about me? He asked, his voice breaking. Sienna sighed. At first, yes, but then... He just stopped. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment. Leo stopped asking, because he accepted that his father would never be there. The pain Ethan felt at that moment was indescribable. When he finally managed to speak, his voice came out almost as a whisper. I want to change that, but I don't know where to start. Sienna watched him for a few seconds before replying. Then start by being constant. Leo doesn't need promises, he needs actions. Ethan nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility fall on him like never before. He had a lot to fix, and no amount of time in the world would be enough to make up for everything he'd lost. As he left the office, Ethan picked up his cell phone and saw a notification. A message from Vivian. We need to talk. Alone. He felt his stomach turn. Was this a good sign? Or a warning that she was about to cut off any chance of closeness? Whatever it was, he was about to find out. Since that night in the restaurant, his life had been turned upside down. Everything that had once seemed important, his reputation, his business, the lavish dinners, was now just noise in the background. He had only one goal, Leo. And for the first time, he felt he was doing something right. Celeste never showed up again. No phone call, no message. No attempt to take back whatever it was they had. Deep down, Ethan knew he didn't need an explanation. She realized the obvious before he even admitted it to himself. He no longer had room for her in the life he was trying to rebuild. Now, there was only Leo. And it was for him that Ethan walked through that cafeteria every day, waiting anxiously for school to let out. It was for him that he spent nights researching autism, trying to understand more about his own son. It was for him that every day she tried to become a man worth having around. But after everything, was Vivian ready to accept him in this new role? The first few meetings with Leo were cautious. The boy was too intelligent to trust him right away. In the first few days, Ethan noticed that Leo didn't like sudden changes. If he said he would pick up his son at 3, he had to be there at 3 sharp. 1 minute late and Leo would get restless and shut down. Ethan learned this the hard way. One afternoon, when he was 5 minutes late, he found Leo with his arms crossed, staring at the sidewalk. You said 3 hours, the boy said, without anger, but with an almost palpable disappointment. Ethan felt like a dead weight falling off a cliff. I know, man, traffic, it won't happen again. Leo just nodded and climbed into the car. It was silent for the rest of the journey. And that's how Ethan realized something. Words meant nothing to Leo. It was consistency that mattered. Then he started showing up, every day, at exactly 3 o'clock, and little by little something incredible happened. Leo began to wait for him. At first, he pretended not to care, but one day, when Ethan showed up at the gate, he saw his son peeking through the classroom window before the bell even rang. Ethan smiled. It was working. The boy started talking more. Little details at first, about school, about how one of his classmates didn't understand how to solve an algebra equation, and he had to explain. Ethan took every opportunity to praise him. That's amazing, Leo. You have a way of looking at numbers that not many people have. The boy just shrugged, but Ethan saw it, saw the small smile he tried to hide, and then came the biggest victory of all. One afternoon, while they were sitting in the cafeteria, Leo took out a napkin and started scribbling down numbers. Ethan watched for a moment before asking, "What are you doing?" "It's a number pattern," Leo said, concentrating. Ethan smiled. "Can I try to solve it?" Leo looked at him in surprise. It was the first time anyone had shown a genuine interest in what fascinated him so much. "You can try," he said, pushing his napkin away. And that's how they spent the whole afternoon. Creating mathematical challenges for each other, laughing, having fun, connecting. And from afar, Vivian watched it all. She saw the way Leo looked at Ethan now, the way the boy no longer seemed tense around his father, and that moved her. Because, try as she might, she couldn't deny it. Ethan was changing. But was that enough? Ethan's phone vibrated as he parked his car in front of the school. Vivian. Today, 7 in the evening, my place. We need to talk. Ethan felt his stomach turn. He knew it would happen. But was it to thank him for his efforts or to say that, despite everything, he still didn't trust him? So he went. When he got there, she started talking. I heard you went to see Leo's therapist, she began bluntly. Ethan held his breath. So she knew. She crossed her arms, staring at him with that analytical look he knew so well. And I want to know why. Why did you think you had to go after her instead of asking me? Ethan felt a slight discomfort. He didn't want Vivian to think he was trying to get around her, but the truth was, he needed to hear it from an outsider. I wanted to understand without interference, he said sincerely. I wanted to know what Leo had been through all these years. And I thought that if I asked you directly it would be unfair. I forced you to carry this weight alone. I didn't want to make you relive it just to catch up. Vivian was silent for a moment. She looked away, and for the first time, Ethan saw something there. It wasn't anger. It wasn't coldness. It was tiredness. She had spent years dealing with everything on her own, and now, for the first time, someone wanted to share the burden with her. I don't know what to say, she admitted, sighing, but I can see that Leo is happy, and that for me is what matters most. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. She was being honest. She wasn't saying it as a provocation, but as a realization. So he asked hesitantly, Does that mean you trust me? Vivian took a deep breath before answering. It means that I want to. Ethan nodded, accepting the answer. It was more than he had expected. But then Vivian said something he definitely wasn't expecting. I wanted to ask you something. Go ahead. If I let you take Leo to spend the weekend with you, would you accept? Ethan froze. Are you serious? Vivian nodded. You've been there, and I know that Leo is starting to get attached to you. He talks about you when he comes home. He says he likes solving challenges with you. He's happy. And I think the time has come for you to spend more time together. Ethan didn't know what to say. He wanted this. He wanted it more than anything. But then she continued. Besides, I'd also like to have some time off for myself. That's when Ethan felt an uncomfortable twinge in his chest. Free time? He repeated, trying to keep his expression neutral. Vivian nodded naturally. Yes, I think it's been a while since I've had some time to myself. To go out, to take a breather from the routine. Ethan swallowed. He wanted to ask. He wanted to demand answers. What did she want this free time for? To meet someone? To go on a date? But she couldn't do that. She didn't have the right. And yet jealousy burned inside him. Vivian noticed the subtle change in his face. But she didn't say anything. She just waited. And then, after a heavy silence, Ethan took a deep breath and nodded. I accept. Vivian smiled slightly. Good. Then we'll make arrangements later. Can it be this weekend? Of course. She nodded and took a small step backwards, ending the conversation. I'll see you tomorrow, then. See you. Ethan's thoughts were in chaos. On the one hand, he was finally getting what he wanted. More time with Leo. Vivian's trust. But on the other, there was a new doubt growing inside him. Was Vivian making space for him? Or was she just moving on, with someone else? He didn't know, and that thought destroyed him more than he'd like to admit. Ethan drove home, still feeling the effect of the conversation. He had achieved something he hadn't thought possible a few weeks ago. Leo would spend the weekend with him. But for some reason, all he could think about was, who was taking up Vivian's free time? If he really was changing, then he also needed to prepare himself for what came next, because if there was one thing he wasn't yet ready to face, it was the thought of losing Vivian forever. Friday dawned sunny, and Ethan could feel his heart racing as he parked his car in front of Vivian's building. Leo would be spending the weekend with him. For the first time. Vivian opened the door and Leo appeared right behind, holding a small backpack. Ready? Ethan asked, trying to sound calm but feeling the weight of the moment. Leo nodded. Yeah. It was simple, no hesitation. This time, Leo wanted to go. Vivian looked at Ethan and said, "He's already had breakfast, but take a coat. Sometimes he gets cold at night and doesn't say anything." "That's fine," Ethan assured her. There was a brief exchange of glances, something unspoken between them. But neither of them broke the silence, and then Leo got into the car and drove off with Ethan. At first, Ethan thought Leo would find it strange to spend so much time away from his routine with his mother. But, to his surprise, the boy adapted quickly. They set up math challenges on the whiteboard in the living room. They made pizza together. They watched a documentary about great minds in science. On the second night, Leo took a book from the shelf and handed it to Ethan. "Can you read it to me?" Ethan froze for a moment. He had never read to his son before. But he took a deep breath, opened the book, and began. Leo sat next to him, listening intently, his eyes fixed on the words. And at that moment, Ethan realized how much that small gesture meant. Leo was comfortable. Leo trusted him. And that was all that mattered. Meanwhile, Vivian took advantage of the silence in the house to do something she hadn't done for a long time. Think about herself. She went out to dinner with her friends, laughed without worrying, drank a glass of wine without having to worry about schedules. She also finished an important project that she had been putting off for weeks. And for the first time, she realized how good it was to have some time to herself, how necessary it was. On Sunday afternoon, Ethan took Leo back. The boy got out of the car and, before getting in, looked at his father. "It was nice," he said simply. To anyone else, it might have seemed like a casual phrase, but Ethan knew how much weight it carried. "Do you want to do it again?" he asked, holding his breath. Leo thought for a moment and then gave a small smile. "Yes." Ethan let out a slow breath. Vivian appeared in the doorway and looked at her son. "Did you have fun?" "Yes," Leo repeated. And he went into the house. Vivian and Ethan stood there for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you for doing things the right way." Ethan just nodded. There was nothing more to say. And as the door closed, he realized that for the first time he wasn't afraid of what would come next. The future was still uncertain. But now he knew he was on the right track. Now it's up to you. What do you think should happen next? Can Vivian and Ethan rebuild something together to bring the family back together? Or should Vivian move on and no longer trust Ethan as a husband, only as the father of her child? Comment below. Family. If you think they should stay together. Move on. If she shouldn't give him a chance. Leave your opinion in the comments. Leave your like and subscribe to support our channel. See you in the next video.